and thank you for joining us in today's NSITSP cybersecurity series. Today, we're really excited to be presenting Mike Semmel. He'll be telling us all about the shared responsibility model, how it's mandatory within CMMC, but can be used with pretty much any client, any framework. So a few ground rules before we get started. If you do have questions about the presentation, please put them in chat. We'll be monitoring that along the way, and we can address those at the end of the presentation. The presentation is being recorded. It will be available in the event space on the NSITSP website. You do have to be a member to view that, but bear that in mind. And at the end of the presentation, we'll be going over a little bit about how to join NSITSP and how to get involved with that. Now, this is the fourth in our series of the Cyber Series framework. And what we've done so far is we've gone over CMMC, we've done CIS, but upcoming we've got the NIST cybersecurity framework in April. We have Wes Spencer presenting that. We have CISA is going to present the latest on what's going on with CISA, what the government agency. There's a lot going on there, so they'll update us on where they're at right now. We're going to do a deep dive into malware phishing in June. We're going to look at the FTC safeguard rules and other financial regulations. We're going to take a look at what it takes to sell cybersecurity. Why build all this stuff if you can't sell it? We're going to look at mastering customer contracts. What are the legal ramifications of being an MSP? We're going to look at PCI. We're going to look at building a security-focused culture. And we'll look at SOC 2. What does that mean? What does that entail? And what does it mean to be HIPAA compliant coming up in January of 26? So we're really excited to be bringing you this series. These are going to be going every month. And so please join in and continue to watch. As I mentioned today, we have Mike Semmel presenting on the shared responsibility model. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike to introduce himself, give you his background, and I will let him take it away now. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks. I'm going to take just 1 second here, share my screen. Hopefully the Zoom gods will be with us. So first of all, thanks everybody for attending today. And what I'm going to talk about, you have the term model, and you're going to see it here listed as matrix. It's really the same thing, and there are different ways that you can describe this. But basically, I was an MSP, and one of the challenges we always had was that our clients always thought that everything that had to do with cybersecurity we were doing for them, and it wasn't the case. Number one, there were things that they had to do. And they had to tell us, for example, who was authorized, who did they hire, who did they fire, should we add to their Active Directory, who should we take out, and so forth. So there was always a responsibility from a client, and it was something that we formalized in all of our agreements. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about today is looking at this shared responsibility model or shared responsibility matrix as something that is official, it's written, it's documented, it's shared with a client, it's acknowledged by a client. So I call this presentation yours, mine, ours, or someone else's, and that has to do with responsibility. And Mark mentioned that we're going to talk about CMMC a little bit here today. Because it's a federal government, they couldn't just leave the term shared responsibility matrix by itself, so they came up with a slightly different version called a customer responsibility matrix. But when you read the definition, it's really the same. So for those of you who don't know me, I've been in this business. It actually says 35-year MSP business owner. 35 years ago, we didn't have MSPs, but we were value-added resellers. And then the MSP business model came along where we were doing proactive service instead of reactive service, and our mission became to prevent problems rather than hoping would happen, because before managed services in the break fix model, we had to hope that somebody's system would have a problem because that was our next opportunity to make money. I've also served as the chief information officer for a hospital and for a K-12 school district. Both of them were regulated, the hospital by HIPAA and the school district by FERPA, which is a law that protects student information, kind of the same way that HIPAA protects healthcare information. I worked on the vendor side as the chief operating officer for one of the first cloud backup services, and I'm certified in business continuity planning and cyber resilience. Got a lot of experience in uh, emergency services. I'm a member of the FBI's InfraGard program. I'm very involved. It says here CompTIA, and at that time it was CompTIA. Now CompTIA has been rebranded as the Global Technology Industry Association, and I'm still involved with that organization. I was at their meeting in Chicago last week. So let's get into, first of all, why do we need a shared responsibility matrix? Well, first of all, it sets everyone's expectations. It defines boundaries. It defines roles and responsibility. I just gave you an example of one where the client has to authorize someone to get access. They make the hiring decision. They do the background checks. They decide what the person's role is in their organization. And at some level, they probably have role-based security. In other words, not every employee gets access to the HR folder that has salaries and HR disciplinary information in it, but somebody in the HR department should have access to that. Those are the types of things that we're talking about in terms of who's responsible for making these decisions. That decision's made by the client. Then they share the information with their IT service provider, their managed service provider, whoever manages their IT for them. And that's the person that actually establishes the access based on the authorization from the client. So you start to see here how this relates to what you do every day. One of the things is that it makes sure that there aren't gaps. It ensures that all the cybersecurity tasks are assigned and performed. Again, the client's the one who's assigned to authorize people to gain access to their data, and then even break it down into the specific types of data. And then finally, this ties to compliance. So you saw on the list of activities that the organization is going to be doing over the next year or so, we're talking about the FTC safeguards rule and HIPAA, and you've already heard about CMMC. This is another way to make sure that compliance is being met, again, because you don't want to have gaps where things fall through the cracks. Here's another reason. And this was what I was afraid of when I was an IT service provider and then an MSP. First of all, if there was a gap, it meant that something might not be managed and there could be an incident. But also, I didn't want to get blamed for something I wasn't responsible for. We wanted to avoid disputes, avoid misunderstandings, avoid legal liability. And when we talk about legal liability, these are the things that you can get blamed for if someone assumes that you're the one supposed to be doing something. And you may be assuming that somebody else is supposed to be doing it. And it's not always the client. Don't forget that there are third parties that are involved here, and I'm going to discuss them. Ultimately, we want to make sure that we're avoiding fines and lawsuits. That's where these problems turn into hard dollars. When we look at regulations, and it really doesn't matter what the regulation is, whether you're in financial services, whether you're a defense contractor, or in healthcare, clients can outsource cybersecurity tasks to IT service providers, but the client always retains the regulatory responsibility. In other words, when the regulators find that there's a problem, they're going to the client. Now, the client may be mad at you and may sue you, for example, if you were supposed to be doing something and you didn't do it, but they're the ones that are holding the bag when it comes to the regulators because they're the ones that are in those industries. So even if you're offering services like fractional chief information security officer services, CISO services, and you're the acting CISO for an organization, even if they're outsourcing all those tasks to you, it's that organization that is the one that has to be compliant with the regulations or with their contracts or with their insurance company. So ultimately, it's their responsibility and they can't get rid of that. Now, where you do come in, where you do have compliance requirements, is when you get what I call flow down compliance requirements from a client. And here you see a picture of a technician holding a hard drive. And I've added this little box that says they have PHI, protected health information, PII, personally identifiable information, or CUI, controlled unclassified information, which is what CMMC is designed to protect. When you have just one healthcare client that is either a healthcare or a HIPAA covered entity or a HIPAA business associate, just one client, here's this. You are a HIPAA business associate, even if they haven't made you sign a business associate agreement. And you have to implement the HIPAA security rule in your organization because that's within the HIPAA law. Financial services requirements, compliance requirements, have requirements for how the client, your client, and the organization that needs to comply with those must manage their third party providers. So there are things that you may have to do. Some of these regulations now say it has to be in the contract that you're going to protect the data at the same level the client is. Remember, you have access to their data in their system. You may also have access to it in a backup environment or some other system that you manage where their data is stored or it's actually running. MSPs that are serving CMMC level 2 defense contractors have specific requirements for the things that are being outsourced to them. And then we don't normally think about these things as regulations or as compliance requirements, but they are. And the reason that I say that things like insurance companies and or insurance policies and contracts with companies that have cyber in them are compliance requirements is that my definition of compliance is easy. It's anything someone else makes you do. So when you're looking at all these things, because the client's outsourcing the services to you, more frankly, because you're taking their money for it, you have responsibilities to make sure that you're meeting requirements and you're protecting that data. So again, look at the picture of the hard drive. If that's got PHI, PII, or CUI on it, you can't just throw it away. And you can't just, give it to somebody. It has to be wiped, it has to be destroyed, whatever is required based on what the next role of that hard drive is going to be. One of the other things that becomes important here is that if you're advertising on your website, for example, that you help clients comply with their regulations, or if you put it in the proposals, we're going to help you comply with HIPAA or the FTC safeguards rule or CMMC, and you don't do that, failing to deliver a promised service is fraud. And the reason I say this is that I've had MSP say to me, well, I've got E&O insurance or our master consulting agreement says we're not responsible for compliance. But if you have promised to deliver a service that you didn't deliver or an outcome that you didn't deliver, a judge can throw out your master services agreement. The insurance company can deny your E&O insurance claim and leave you hanging there. So the reason I'm bringing this up is it all ties into this discussion about shared responsibilities. But when you say you're going to do something, you have a legal obligation to do it, not just because you're a nice person and you want to help your customer. So now let's look at a shared responsibility matrix and what it is. First of all, it's always written. Again, we're trying to avoid assumptions and misunderstandings, which means that you want to write this and you want to write it in language that people understand. It needs to be comprehensive and it needs to cover all cybersecurity tasks. And the best way to do this is to base this on a framework. Now, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you a link you can go to get the presentation and a sample of a shared responsibility matrix that's built on the NIST cybersecurity framework. I'm also going to give you the ability to download the CMMC reference guide that I wrote. The reason I'm bringing those things up right now is that you're trying to build out your shared responsibility matrix. Instead of you taking the responsibility for coming up with what you think the best cybersecurity methods are, if you base it on a framework, it's something that you can defend later and will be accepted by regulators. And your lawyer would be really happy if you based your services on a framework rather than just winging it if they end up in court having to defend you. So I recommend that you base your framework, I'm sorry, you base your SRM on a framework. It could be NIST, it could be HIPAA, it could be CMMC. It needs to be acknowledged in writing by your client. This is for your legal protection. It should be referenced in agreements. I'm going to show you how we do that in my consulting company that I have now. We're not an MSP, we're not an IT service provider anymore. We work with regulated clients to make sure that they're compliant with the regulations, including the things that their MSP or other IT professional can't do for them. The SRM needs to be dynamic and subject to change. And if your client changes a system, or if they buy someone, or if they're acquired, or something major changes with their platforms, you need to go back in and make sure that everything's still defined properly in the shared responsibility matrix. Again, I mentioned that CMMC changed the term and calls it a customer responsibility matrix, but they formalized this in the regulations. For CMMC level 2, and level 2 is the first level that a defense contractor has to implement if they have controlled unclassified information. They may have to go to level 3, but in order to do that, they have to meet the level 2 requirements first. So the definition of the CRM, not the SRM, but it's the same thing, says that it takes the CMMC assessment objectives. So if you're familiar with CMMC, it's based on the NIST Special Publication 800-171 framework. Revision 2 is what's in effect right now for CMMC. That has 110 requirements, but there's an accompanying assessment guide, 171A. And in there, it breaks the 110 items down to 320 specific assessment objectives. That's what the CRM under CMMC needs to include. It's a required document for CMMC defense contractors who outsource cybersecurity to external service providers. And in this case, it'd be either a managed service provider, an MSP, or a managed security service provider, an MSSP. The client actually has to have this in their hands when they contact the certified third-party assessor organization, plan their assessment and to schedule it. If they don't have a CRM and they tell the assessing organization that they work with an MSP, but they don't have the document, their assessment won't even get scheduled. But then when the assessment is scheduled, the MSP/MSSP must attend the client's assessment and in front of the assessors take full ownership of all the requirements in the CRM that are being handled by the managed service provider. So it's not just the document that you hand to your client and say, okay, here are the things I'm doing for you, here are the things that you need to do. That's what's in a shared responsibility matrix or a customer responsibility matrix. You actually become part of the assessment, and you're the one that has to prove with all the evidence, the documentation, being able to answer questions during an interview, and being able to show that you're doing it if the assessor asks you to test something and prove it to them, that you have to be responsible for these things. So this is a big change, and we've never seen anything like this in the MSP industry, where MSPs are now formally being assessed as part of their clients' assessments. I've been doing cybersecurity compliance assessments for over 20 years, first as an MSP, and then as a consultant where we work with end user clients who hire us, and many of them work with MSPs. We've told those MSPs all along, we're really assessing you because we're looking at things like encryption and MFA and all the other technical features that need to be implemented to protect either financial data or healthcare data. It's the MSP that's answering the question. And when we scan a network and find unencrypted devices, it's the MSP that the client gets mad at because their contract said all devices are supposed to be encrypted. So this really has formalized the role of an IT service provider in a client's assessment. What we've done with our projects, and I did this as an MSP, is that we kind of had a general shared responsibility matrix that we gave to clients. Again, saying things like, you authorize access, we establish it. So it was generic and it kind of covered all the different things that we did. But then we also, as we were writing proposals, we wrote into the proposals not a table of information, but what the client's responsibilities are and our responsibilities are. So it's always written, it's always in our proposals. We do this every day, including today when I sign off on a proposal. It needs to be acknowledged in writing by the client. In other words, the shared responsibility information is part of the agreement. And it should simply define your responsibilities and your client's responsibilities. We do a lot of risk assessments. And the reason we do a risk assessment, it's a cybersecurity risk assessment, but calls it a security risk analysis, is that it's a requirement in every framework and every cybersecurity regulation that I've ever seen. So our responsibilities, and these are the words that come right out of our agreements. We're going to scan the client's network. We're going to compare findings from our scans to the regulatory requirements that the client faces. We're going to provide a written report and we're going to deliver an executive presentation by a certified expert. Now, if we just left it at that, there are a lot of things that could go wrong that could prevent us from meeting those requirements. And if we just left those in our contract and didn't say to the client, there are things you need to in order for us to do our job, we could be sued for breach of contract if, for example, we didn't scan the network or we didn't do the executive presentation. So here's the next section, your responsibilities. This is to the client. You need to provide us with temporary domain admin access to your network. That's what we need to be able to scan the network. You need to provide a list of current workforce members and vendors. So when we download an Active Directory user list or user list for software like Microsoft 365, that it's not just a list of names to us. We don't know those people. We need to see the list of your current employee and the vendors that have access to your system so we can match it up. We recently did this with a healthcare client and found a huge mismatch between the employees that had access to the Active Directory. There are only a couple of names on the Active Directory list that shouldn't have been there, but we found over 100 users of their electronic health record system that were former employees. And we found out as we peeled the onion to understand why that happened, the person in charge of doing the administration on that system didn't know how to properly disable access, believe it or not. So we couldn't have done that if they had given us the list of current workforce members. And then they have to respond to our requests within 5 business days. And finally, they need to schedule the executives for a presentation. So look at this and imagine we didn't put those requirements into our agreement. And we said, yeah, we're going to scan the client network. We're going to compare the findings. We're going to provide a written report and do an executive presentation. And they just went dark on us. And we couldn't do any of that. And they sued us and said, we signed a contract. We paid you a lot of money to do all these things. You didn't do them. So now we've got some guardrails in here that tell the client, yeah, but here are the things you need to do to make our work possible. So let's look at some steps to success when it comes to how to build a shared responsibility matrix. And again, remember, I'm going to give you a template you can use and you can modify for your own. First of all, you need to identify each client system. I use that term specifically, client system, and the reason for it is you also want to include the technology that you don't manage. When I had my IT business and we were a managed service provider, we had blinders on pretty much when we went to clients. We handled their network, we handled their servers. This back in the days when people had servers on site. We didn't have everything in the Microsoft cloud like people do today. We didn't have many mobile devices that time. Certainly didn't have much IoT. And when I put IoT down, I'm talking about more consumer products, but then industrial IoT could be the automatic door locking systems or the lighting systems, video surveillance, and things like that. And then operational technology. OT. If you're in a doctor's office, it would be the ultrasound or the x-ray machine that's connected to the network so that it can produce images, but also the vendors can log in and maintain those things or fix problems. But these are the things that you need to make sure you understand the full landscape. Go beyond what you service and include the cloud services, the IoT, the operational technology, anything that you don't manage. And the reason why you want to identify that, remember I said we're trying to avoid gaps here. You want to make sure that you tell the client, we're responsible for your network. Well, if they think that because there's a machine connected to the network or an ultrasound connected to the network, that you're going to handle it or you're responsible for it, even though you don't touch it. You may have given it an IP address for the vendor, but they're the ones that maintain it. You want to define these things. ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning, that would be the system that, say, a manufacturing company would use to schedule the machines on the shop floor. If you're not handling that, now, when I was an MSP, we had clients with HR and payroll services. We never managed those. There was somebody in their finance department or HR department that was the one that gave access and took away access to that. I gave the example of the medical client with the or the unauthorized users who still had access to their systems. So these are the things you want to define. Again, part of shared responsibility is to make sure the client understands that they're responsible for everything related to those systems where you're the one that's doing patches and updates, for example, on the devices you manage. You're not, probably not touching the machines on the shop floor. That's up to the client to make sure that gets done. So, who are the parties in an organization when it comes to a shared responsibility model or matrix? Well, first of all, you being the IT service provider, but you have third parties. I assume everybody has third party security solutions that you're delivering and maybe installing on the client's devices or managing through a console. And when it comes to this, it's important now to be more transparent than you may have been in the past. When I was an MSP, we really didn't want to tell our clients about the tools we use. But now, if I was an MSP, our clients would know all about the tools we're using because I don't want the legal liability if something fails with one of those tools. I can't control it. And you know that RMM tools have been hit and other types of security tools, password managers have been hit by hackers. And if you're providing those tools to your clients, you want to make sure that you're distinguished from those tools because you're not going to want to take the legal responsibility if one of your tools fails and that causes a problem with the client. Then, of course, you have the client, and the client would be the client's organization. The client may have third parties also. So if there's a machine on the shop floor, they may have the machine manufacturer or the company that sold them the machine have access to it. We see it a lot with copiers. Where I was an MSP, we didn't sell copiers. I know there are a lot of MSPs that do, but we were working with copier companies who were the ones needed access to the network because now they were going to manage the copiers. Again, you want to identify who these responsible parties are. And then you want to define the cybersecurity tasks that need to be managed. You can do it generically. In other words, you can make up your own list. I don't recommend that. I would do something like framework specific. So CIS, Centers for Internet Services, CIS controls, the IG1, IG2, IG3, and so forth. NIST Cybersecurity Framework, NIST Special Publication 800-171 for defense contractors. You could make it regulation specific. Here's what HIPAA requires, and here's what our tasks are going to be, our responsibilities are, and here's what yours are as a client. For example, as an MSP, you may provide things like cybersecurity training services, where your clients can have their staffs trained using a platform that you're providing as part of a service or selling them as a separate service. But they're the ones, their responsibility is when they hire someone to make sure they go through it. Or if there's an annual requirement in a regulation, to make sure that the entire staff goes through it on the schedule that's required. So here again, you have different ways of doing this. But here's how I like to do it. First of all, I'm a proponent of the NIST cybersecurity framework above other frameworks that could be used for general businesses. When I say a general business, I'm really talking about anything other than CMMC Level 2 defense contractors. You could take the NIST cybersecurity framework and add just a few items for HIPAA, add just a few items for the FTC safeguards rule or the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. CMMC Level 1 is not a heavy lift for any managed service provider because it only has 15 requirements. It doesn't have any of the strict controls that you see at level 2. New York State Department of Financial Services Part 500 is a regulation that was actually built based on the NIST framework. And even though it says New York State, it's for businesses that are licensed in New York State. So there are financial service organizations, insurance companies, investment houses, and so forth all across the country that have to meet that requirement because they're licensed to do business in New York, even if they don't have a physical presence there. Contracts. We have a client that sends me new contracts that they're asked to sign. This is an insurance agency. These are the big insurance companies that are sending them the contracts. And recently they sent me a contract, said, please look at it and let us know what we have to do, if we have to do anything for this insurance underwriter. And I looked at it, and the first thing I did was I said, well, you have to spend $50,000 or so on a SOC 2 every year because that's one of their requirements in their cybersecurity addendum. And they came back and said they're negotiating that out because they don't expect to do $50,000 a year with that underwriter, and they're certainly not going to spend that for a SOC 2. We do a risk analysis for them, so they're substituting our services for the SOC 2, and we don't charge anywhere near what a SOC 2 costs. And then finally, cyber insurance. So if you take the NIST cybersecurity framework, you have very few things that you would need to add to it for these other requirements. Why NIST? Well, first of all, and I've mentioned this, it's a government standard that will stand up in court if it's challenged. There's a little box over at right, or a note at the right, that says, CIS is a great organization, and it is. But according to attorney Paul Green, who I do speaking engagements with, he recommends the NIST cybersecurity to his clients. He specializes and is certified as a lawyer for cyber incidents. And he recommends the NIST cybersecurity framework. And it's as simple as this. He told me that if he's standing in front of a judge or a jury defending you in a cyber case, he would rather say you met the US government standard rather than try to start explaining who CIS is, which is a nonprofit organization. So that's one of the reasons that I look at this more from a business standpoint than a technology standpoint. The other thing about NIST is that it aligns with, and in many cases, is the basis for other regulations like the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, the FTC Safeguards Rule, New York State DFS Part 500. It's the official basis for CMC. Now, notice I didn't say the NIST cybersecurity framework at the top. I'm saying NIST is an entity. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is an advisory agency in the US government, not an enforcement agency. They wrote Special Publication 800-171. That's the basis for CMMC. And they also have contractual requirements that are tied to this in DFARS. If you're not familiar with DFARS, those are the contract clauses actually in defense contracts that require cybersecurity and will require CMMC soon. There are regulatory benefits for implementing the NIST cybersecurity framework. For example, if you're a healthcare organization governed by HIPAA and you have an incident, or if you're audited and you can prove implemented the NIST cybersecurity framework of the previous year, if you're being audited, they will end the audit and automatically pass you. If you've had an incident, they'll reduce your penalty. And that recently happened. It was November or December 2024 that they announced a HIPAA penalty against an organization and said they were reducing the penalty because they had implemented the NIST cybersecurity framework. It also is tied to state affirmative defense laws. Those are laws that don't tell you you must do something, but they say if you did it, for example, implementing the NIST cybersecurity framework, and you're sued after an incident, the jury has to find that you weren't negligent. So there are benefits to that, and it's internationally recognized. So now when we look at creating the shared responsibility model, three columns, at least three columns. The MSP, if you're not an MSP, you could call yourself an IT professional or evaluated reseller, whatever term you want to use. But this is the organization that the client's outsourcing technology tasks to, then the client, and then third parties. So generally, these are the categories. The MSP responsible for infrastructure security and management, data protection, threat detection, compliance monitoring and reporting, security awareness and training, vulnerability management and patching, and data backups. These are the technical things that our clients outsource to us when I was an MSP. But it's up to the client to make sure that they're properly governing access to their data. User access and identity management is tied to the client. Even if we're using tools like multi-factor authentication, again, they're the ones that are authorizing the person to gain access to the data. The client's compliant. The client's the one that's supposed to develop their own policies. Now, you may offer them support or you may offer policies as part of your service, but it's the client's organization that has to adopt those policies and make them official and enforce them. Incident reporting and response, it says here participation. So you may be the technical lead on an incident, but they're the ones who are going to be talking to their attorney, their insurance company, and maybe their clients, because we're seeing a lot of these contracts now say that if there's an incident, you have to notify your client that an incident took place. And then at the bottom, I put here in bold letters, all items under MSP responsibilities for out of scope assets. In other words, if you're the MSP and you're doing all the things on the left for the client, for the systems you manage, again, if they have systems, let's say there's a computer connected to a machine on the shop floor, they've taken over all that MSP responsibility from you because that computer is out of scope of their contract. And then you have third parties. So think of third parties being cloud services or security tool vendors and things like that. They're the ones that manage the data protection and the compliance and the backups of their own environment. You're not the one that's responsible for doing it. But now when we look at this, we also have to take into account what vendors are doing. So this on the left is Microsoft's shared responsibility model. And you can see that when they're a cloud customer, that Microsoft's responsible for just about everything. But when you are a cloud, when you're looking at the client's responsible for, look at the boxes on the right, and you get down to Microsoft 365 backup. This is where you as an MSP need to educate the client that even though Microsoft may have a copy of all their data in multiple data centers for high availability, in case Microsoft has a problem, that's a business part of their business continuity process. They may have the client's data in two data centers, let's say East Coast and West Coast, and if the East Coast data center goes down, the West Coast takes over. But that's not backing up the data in case of an emergency. So this is where you want to look at the vendors that you're working with to see what theirs are. Here's a screenshot of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, just had its first birthday. It came out at the end of February last year, and it really changed the NIST framework. The original version of the NIST framework, and you may be familiar with this, had 5 sections: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. This one added govern, and it put govern in the middle of the circle, touching everything else. Govern means that if you don't know what your regulations are and your requirements, you're probably not doing identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover properly. So what you can see here is the first 4 columns, the function category, subcategory, and implementation examples. These all came from NIST. I added 2 columns. What's the MSP's responsibility and what's the customer's responsibility? So there are just over 100 items in the NIST cybersecurity framework. Obviously, this is just a small screenshot of just a couple of them, but we're providing you with this so that you can start with this and you can modify it, you can copy things out. If you've got your own shared responsibility matrix that you're working with now, you may want to take some information out of here. You could copy it. This is free for you to use and implement in your own organization. One of the things that I see, and I've seen over the years from the time I was an MSP, and since I've been doing an awful lot of assessments of clients of MSPs, I want to show you some steps to success for every MSP. And if you don't classify yourself as an MSP, for every IT professional. First of all, when you're delivering services, you can't just wing it and decide on your own without looking at anything else how you want to do that. You need to deliver services in a way that aligns with your client compliance requirements. And that means that you need to review the cybersecurity controls that are in those compliance requirements. You need to be an expert in the compliance requirement, but you need to understand what's required. For example, HIPAA requires encryption of protected health information. If you're working with healthcare organizations and you don't know that, you might not be delivering the level of cybersecurity they need. You want to then, because you're like me, you weren't limited to just one industry. We had healthcare clients, we had financial service clients, we had defense contractor clients. You want to compile a list of overlapping requirements and translate all those requirements into the services that you deliver. So you can make sure you're delivering them right. You can also show the clients how you're helping comply and build out your services to cover all of the items in each one of your clients' compliance requirements. Step two is making sure that the scope of what you offer is defined and what's not included is also defined. So you want to properly scope what systems you manage and what the client's responsibility, and then define your liability. That's actually in your legal terms and conditions. You want to make sure, for example, responsible for only direct damages and not consequential damages. Direct damages would be if you're working with a law firm and they lose, let's say, 4 hours of billing and they bill $2,000 an hour, you might be on the hook for $8,000. But if they lose their biggest client, who's worth $3 million a year to them, you want to make sure that you're not responsible for that consequential damage, only the direct damage that you may have caused. And as much as you think you're doing a good job, sometimes bad things happen, and that's why you have terms and conditions in your cyber insurance. You also want to define your liability in financial terms, what the limit of your liability would be if you have some sort of a dispute or an incident. Then you want to implement the shared responsibility matrix. What we're talking about today is a key part of this. Define the systems you manage. Remember, you did that in the scope. Define your responsibilities, your vendor's responsibilities. And again, you want to separate yourself from the tools you use so you're not liable if they have one of the problems or have a problem. And finally, define your client's responsibilities. We use risk-based selling in our organization. I've done this when I was a value-added reseller, when I was a managed service provider, now as a consultant. We literally wrote a proposal today showing the client what their risk would be based on what they told us their risk is, and use that to justify our fees. Otherwise, our fees are always ridiculously high. But in this case, our fees are very low compared to what the client's risk is. And they told us that. So first of all, you want to work with clients to define the client's risks and your prospects' risks. Don't forget, clients are, even after you've brought them in as client, you still need to be quote unquote selling your value to them, because you don't want them to leave or think that, they can do cybersecurity themselves. The hard part, and this is the part that we do and we've developed the skill to do very well, is quantify those risks in dollars. And even if the client hasn't had an incident, well, it can base it on headline penalties and the things they've told us. Have a discussion with the client to get them to agree to their risk profile. I hear from MSPs all the time, people don't buy our cybersecurity services because they don't think they're big enough to be a target or they have anything anybody wants to steal. You got to get them past that, and there are ways to do it. And then convince them that you can help them so well that they will not even consider your competition. Took me years and thousands of dollars, including going down a whole lot of rabbit holes and wasting a lot of time and money to implement these steps, which once I did them, brought me great success. You don't have to do that. We've developed training systems for IT professionals, and the core is the SEML system, which has my own framework where I've taken the NIST framework, I've taken HIPAA, FTC safeguards rule, CMMC level one, a whole bunch of different things, put them all together in one long list of services that if you deliver your services that way, your clients will automatically comply and you don't have to learn all the regulations. We include a whole module on the shared responsibility matrix, a lot of which you're getting here today. There's a section on MSP protection and what things to put in your agreements and how to write your proposals. Make sure that you are protected. And I'm talking about your personal investment, your retirement, if you're looking to sell, that you're not going to kill the value of your company by doing something wrong. And finally, a whole training class on risk-based selling. We put together a guide called Compliance for Profit, where we take industry, so like law firms and accountants and local government and school districts, and for each one of those, what the requirements are that they have to meet. Remember, I said that I was the CIO in a healthcare organization and then a school district. I was able to take a lot of what I did in the hospital to secure data for HIPAA and apply it to the school district to secure the student data for FERPA. And we show you what these different things are. So when talking to people in the industries, you're using language that they appreciate. Then, of course, federal and state laws and regulations and cyber insurance and contracts. We put it all together in a solution called Clients Essentials for MSPs, and that's the SEML system and Compliance for Profit. We're just now, like next week, or probably the week after, bringing this to market. It's going to cost your investment in your own success would be $697. Don't do 3-year subscriptions like some vendors do. But here's the payoff, and this is something that I always looked at when I was an MSP. $697 is a lot of money, but when you look at just adding, if you can just add one new $2,000 a month client, just one client, based on our training, you can earn $43,200 in profits, which is 62 times your investment in just 3 years. These are all the things that I calculated when I was going to a conference, when I was looking to hire a consultant to do some work for me, if I was looking to buy a training package for myself or a certification that I needed to use for my engineers and techs. If you add one client per quarter, in other words, once you get your sales rolling, that's $226,800 in profit over 3 years, or 325 times your investment. You can literally implement the SEML system in 30 days. We guarantee satisfaction, and we've got some higher level products called Compliance Mastery for MSPs and CMMC for MSPs. The full purchase price can be applied to that. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you the QR code. And then, Mark, we can open this up to questions. So there's a link here. I know that there are IT professionals who don't like QR codes. I've got both. And if you go to this link, you can download the slide presentation, the sample NIST cybersecurity framework, shared responsibility matrix, and also my CMMC reference guide. I don't know how many of you know my friend Josh Lieberman from Albuquerque, but he sent me a note and said it's the most actionable CMMC information he's ever looked at. So I thank Josh for that, but this is done to try to help you, try to help defense contractors and IT professionals be successful with CMC. So at this point, Mark, are there questions? Are there things you want to talk about? Where do we go from here?
I just put that link in the chat for everybody to know. So you can grab it there if you don't want to do the QR code. And we did have one early on, just what is SRM? So I took the liberty of answering that as the shared responsibility matrix. This was prior to you going into the whole thing. So I think we're good on that one. Anybody else, if you have any questions, please type them into chat now. Um, and I guess one thing that I would, if you can expand on a little bit, Mike, is, of course, I just came off my CCP training, so I'm like, I'm top of mind on everything. When it comes to an assessor coming in and looking at the shared responsibility matrix for the OSC, the organization seeking compliance or certification, um, what uh, what is the assessor looking for from the MSP? What exactly are they there to provide?
So, first of all, you and I are both in the CMMC ecosystem, and we share this language back and forth. So Mark got his CP, a CMMC certified professional training. I'm a CMMC certified assessor and a certified professional and a registered practitioner. So where the CRM came from is that there's been this question since CMC began about what's the role of a managed service provider in client's assessment. Think about it from the assessment standpoint, not the everyday services and all that. So the CRM is the document that takes the 320 assessment objectives, not the 110 practices or requirements for CMMC, but all those individual 320 assessment objectives, and it breaks it down and it says, this is your responsibility, this is our responsibility. So, for example, the first requirement in CMMC is 3.1.1, and it says limit access to authorized users, authorized processes, or processes acting on behalf of authorized users, and authorized devices. It seems simple enough. But when we look at the assessment objectives, there are 6 assessment objectives. And the first one is authorized users identified. Are processes acting on behalf of authorized users identified? And then are authorized devices identified? Then the next 3 requirements is access limited to authorized users, is access limited to authorized or processes, and then is access limited to authorized devices. So I've had MSP say, "Oh yeah, we're doing that." And I go, "How are you authorizing the users?" And they, well, they're not. The client is. And even in the idea that you are an IT professional, you have a team of IT professionals. We had 6 engineers and a bunch of technicians that we gave access to client networks. It was really the client that was authorizing us to do that. They weren't necessarily doing each individual employee. They weren't doing background checks on my employee. I would go to them and say, here's the list of our technicians that are accessing your network. And that way, they were still the ones authorizing it. So when you break this down, those 6 assessment objectives, the first one are authorized users identified. That's the client's responsibility because they're the ones that authorize it. Are the processes acting on behalf of authorized users identified? That's really an MSP thing because generally, when we were the MSPs, the processes were, automatic patching and updating, automatic backups, and things like that. The clients weren't doing those things. But then when you get to authorized devices, that's the client. We just bought the computer. We need somebody's tablet connected or whatever. Again, they're the ones authorizing the device. So in the shared responsibility model, the assessor is going to look at that and say to the MSP, okay, you're not responsible for authorizing the users. You're not responsible for authorizing devices. You as the MSP, because we're looking at your shared responsibility matrix, have said you're responsible for limiting access. Show how you're limiting access to the device, to only authorized devices. So that's where the assessor is going to look at the shared responsibility model or the CRM under CMMC and decide what's the MSP's responsibility. Now, there are different guides for CMMC. There's a scoping guide, there's an assessment guide for each level. There's level 1, level 2, and level 3. There's also a CMMC assessment process guide from the Cyber AB that oversees the CMMC program. And that says, came out in January. So it was pretty late to the game, or actually middle of December. It was late to the game. It said that an MSP literally needs to be present at the client's assessment. And these are the terms they use, take ownership of all of the tasks that are in the CRM that are assigned to the MSP. So when it says you have to prove this, You as the MSP will be the one that proves it with documentation, documented procedures, reporting, all that for the things that are under your column in the CRM.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it really ratchets up what an MSP is expected to do in any audit of in anything, and so yeah, thank you for expanding on that. I don't see any more questions in the chat. If anybody does have one, you can shoot one out now with the last couple of minutes that we've got going here. But I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you, Mike, for joining us today. This was really enlightening. Um, I'm a firm believer that the shared responsibility matrix is a huge tool for both. I think you mentioned it as pre-sale and post-sale. I've looked at it as something that a VCIO could be referring back to occasionally on a QBR, something like that. It can be a really, really powerful tool. So I really appreciate you stepping us through that process. And yeah, so great. There is one question coming up. How does the SEML system help MSPs with designing our contracts to CMMC clients?
Well, it's a great question. So when it comes to contracts, the first thing I tell everybody is I'm not a lawyer. And there are some really great lawyers that understand our industry at the level where you think they used to be MSPs and then became lawyers. So the first thing I'll tell you is that when it comes to designing a contract, we use a master services agreement. Those are all the terms and conditions. That doesn't really define anything for the particular service that we're delivering. And then we use an engagement letter that refers to the terms and conditions to define what the scope of the project is, what the services are we're providing, your responsibilities and our responsibilities. That all is what we're talking about. So when it comes to describing this, it's the terms that the client understands, that we understand, we agree to for us to deliver the project. But the terms and conditions are written by attorneys. And the reason for it is, even though I've been in this business for over 40 years, there are things about state laws, there are things about case laws and incidents that have happened. What happens if your RMM tool gets hacked? It wasn't your fault, but it affects all your clients. There are words that can be added to protect yourself in those agreements. So we don't advise specifically on any of the wording. People have asked me for my master services agreement because they want to copy it. The answer, no. It's the one thing that literally keeps it, protect the value of your business and your lifestyle. This is worth spending money on an attorney for. So when it comes to this, we talk about what you need, but not the wording that goes into it. That you need to get an attorney familiar with your state laws, familiar with your particular requirements. One of the reasons is we have MSEs that not every managed service provider is the same, and some are doing things that are different. For example, some have their own backup services. And I met one that does file transfers of sensitive data, protected data from one database to another. Their master services agreement would look a lot different than ours. So when it comes to this, uh, my answer is it's in there, but we don't give like the legal advice. There's how do we help you select E&O and liability insurance? That's one of the questions. Again, we're not going to talk about brands or underwriters, but again, you have insurance companies and you have insurance companies. There are insurance companies that understand the MSP industry inside and out and what the risks are and the types of services that you offer. And in some cases, represent multiple carriers, because I know some carriers have gotten antsy in the last few years and have avoided the MSP business or not written more insurance for MSPs. Oh, if you look on the slide, you'll see my email address there, I'll just put it in the chat. It's Mike at Semel Consulting. Let's make sure I spell it right. If you send me a note, I'll be glad to give you names of some people. No recommendations. This is just like I'm going to introduce you to somebody at a party who says that they know the industry. It's up to you to determine if these people are right for you. But I know some of the best professional lawyers and insurance people in the MSP business, and I know who I've done business with that have worked with me to make sure I'm legally protected, and that's both on the insurance side and on the contract side. Um, is it possible for a solo NSP to do all this? It seems a bit overwhelming. Well, first of all, the answer is yes. And I'll ask you the question, if you don't do something like this, how long are you going to be a solo MSP? And I'm not trying to be sarcastic. I'm really saying if you don't properly set the expectations of clients and determine what you're doing and what they're doing, and maybe you're not going to implement the whole NIST cybersecurity framework. So maybe you offer them a handful of services and say, hey, when it comes to patching and updating, we'll do it on the systems that are in the scope of our agreement, but you're the one that will be responsible for any other systems that are connected to your network that you get from somebody else. We dealt with copiers. We dealt with a lot of different devices that we weren't managing that needed firmware updates and patches and updates. They're computers just like everything else. I called an MSP one day from a medical office, and I said to the MSP, I'm in one of the exam rooms and I see this computer connected to a medical device. Was that on the inventory you gave me? And he said, no, it's not a computer. I said, well, it's funny. It's black and it says Dell on it. And he says, no, no, no. I mean, it came with that. I think it was an ultrasound as a kit. And we gave it an IP address, but we haven't touched it since. This is the type of thing we want to make sure is clearly understood between you and your clients. Even if you're working alone, you want to make sure that they understand you're not responsible for that. And if that machine or that device gets infected or whatever, that's their problem, not yours. And you don't want to be held legally responsible, and you don't want to have your agreement so vague that they think you're going to fix a problem for something they're not paying you for. So, um, will the link be sent for compliance essentials? Yes, we're going to follow up with you on that. Let's see what other questions there are.
I think that's it for questions. I
Okay.
think
Yep.
couple of comments. Yep. All right. Well, thank you again, Mike. And just you mentioned about talking to a lawyer about legal problems. Just a little plug for an upcoming webinar that we have. It's not till September, but we do have a lawyer who specializes in MSP practices. She's going to present in September and go through all of that stuff. And perhaps you can ask your questions of that then. But yeah, that's
Hey,
great.
Mark, do me a favor and everybody on this call a favor. At
Sure.
least share her contact information with the people that are on this call, because there's a lot of time, there's a lot of risk between now and September. So if
Yeah.
somebody's thinking about it and wants help with their agreement, just share her information and let's get started, because boy, I'd hate to have something happen between now and September because somebody's waiting for a webinar.
Yeah. Great idea. Great idea. Thanks. And if I can get you to stop sharing your screen, I'm going to share mine again and just do some wrap up, just a bit about NSITSP. So I'll now share mine.
Got it?
There we go. Should be good. So everybody, thank you for joining. If you're not a member of NSITSP today, take a look, come to our website, nsitsp.org/join. Take a look at the membership options. And please, look at the events that are coming up. All of these webinars are going to be on there, as well as some other events that we have going on. And again, once you become a member, you can get to the recorded library of all these events. We're really building out a great library of good content in there. And then finally, we have next month, please join us when we have Wes Spencer of Empath and formerly of ConnectWise and his previous organizations. He's going to be going over, as Mike spent a lot of time talking about today, the NIST cybersecurity framework. So he's going to give you some background on what that, really a deep dive into that in terms of what that's all about and how it compares to some of the other frameworks we've been discussing. So join us on April 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can go and register at that events link that I said earlier. So again, everybody, thank you for joining us. This has been a great thing. And again, Mike, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for your time today.